All right. So here we go. Number 13, we'll say this is supply. And we're going to start with the law of supply. Okay? And you're going to find that basically the notes that we took on Thursday over demand will be the same as the notes that we take today, except, okay, everything will be the same except Thursday we talked about demand. Today we're using the same concepts, but talking about supply. Okay, so very, very similar. So the law of supply states that as price increases, the quantity supplied is going to also increase. Oops. As price increases, the quantity supplied will also increase. And all that means is when the price of something goes up, as a supplier, we are willing to spend more of our time, energy, and effort to supply more of that product. Whether it's time that we're going to work, or whether it's you're producing, donuts at a bakery. When the price goes up, you're going to want to make more, okay? Because you can get more back for what you are producing. And the opposite is also true. We'll say as the price falls, we'll say as price decreases, the quantity supplied is going to decrease. And that's the law of supply. Okay? So remember, we have law of demand, law of supply. Law of demand is how buyers react to changes in price. Law of supply is all about how suppliers react to a change in price. Tomorrow we'll spend time combining those concepts together and looking at what that looks like. Okay? All right, now let's talk about graphing supply. So our supply graph is always going to, let's see, here we have our graph. And we're always showing the relationship between price and quantity, just like demand. Price, put quantity on our horizontal axis. And really what we're doing is we're just illustrating the law of supply concept. Okay? So our demand curve illustrates the law of demand. Supply curve illustrates the law of supply. And that law of supply concept is that as price increases, the amount that we're going to supply is also going to increase. So our supply curve is always going to be upward sloping. It doesn't really matter what supply we're talking about. As long as the law of supply holds true, your supply curve will always look like this. And we can plug some numbers in here. From our example, we'll say that, at $16, we can use this graph to show how many hours we'd be willing to supply. And let's just say that the quantity was 30. Okay? And when we drop down to 10, now the quantity supplied is going to be, we'll say 20. And when the price was at, let's say, 4, we were willing to work, let's say, 2 hours. So what you can see then is that as the price increases, the amount of time that we were willing to supply was also going to increase. That's the law of supply. And we can do this with anything that is being supplied in our economy. All right, next, just like we did with demand, okay? We talked about the difference between a change in quantity supplied and a change in, or quantity demanded and change in demand, we're going to do the same thing with supply. So let's just put down change in quantity supplied versus a change in supply. And just like we said with demand, a change in quantity demanded only happens when there's a change in price. Same thing with supply. Okay? Every point on that supply curve represents a specific amount that we would supply at different prices. That's the quantity supplied. Let's just put down here, change in quantity supplied, and I'm going to abbreviate here, quantity supplied equals a price change only and we move along our curve. We move along the curve. So when there's a price change only, nothing else changes, we move from one point to another point along our supply curve. Okay? And we call that a change in quantity supplied. Now, when we have a change in supply, match, put down change in supply, that happens when something other than price changes. So we'll put here something other than price changes and we shift the entire curve. So we have two separate changes. One, we move along our curve, call that a change in quantity demanded. And the other is when we shift our whole supply curve, we call that a change in supply. Okay? Let's say quantity demanded a minute ago. If I did, I meant quantity supplied. Okay. Last thing that we are going to do today is we have to talk about what are the factors. Okay, we call those determinants in this class. So on Thursday, we put down the determinants of demand, and those are the factors that cause our demand to shift. Okay, and if you went back to the reinforcement questions that I gave you for homework, all of those scenarios that I listed should have been able to be placed in one of the determinant categories. Okay? Those are all the factors that cause the demand to change. Today, we talk about all the factors that cause the supply to change outside of price. Okay? So I'm going to put a new, skip ahead here, and we'll put supply determinants. Supply determinants. Again, these are the factors that would cause the supply of a good to change, okay? And our supply determinants spell the word rotten. Has nothing to do with the roadkill example. Just a coincidence. Okay. So there are 6 things that cause our supply, or can cause our supply to change. Okay. The first, the R, stands for resource costs. Resource costs. And really what this is referring to is when the price to produce our product changes. So let's say you're making donuts, okay? And you're supplying a certain amount of donuts. Well, you have your resources are the things that you have to buy to then go and make a donut, like sugar or flour or whatever else that you need, okay, to make your donuts. When the price of those resources increase, that's going to limit how many donuts you're going to be able to produce, okay? So an increase in resource prices is actually going to cause a decrease in the amount that we're going to be able to supply, okay? And we see this determinant seems to show up quite a bit. All right, the O stands for other goods prices. So if you own a bakery, you probably make more than just donuts. Let's say you make donuts and you make muffins, okay? If we're talking about supplying donuts, okay, you are willing to supply X number of donuts every single day. But what happens if the price of muffins starts to increase? As a supplier, you want to supply more muffins to take advantage of the fact that you can make more money off of those muffins, right? And so when there's a change in price of something that's related to donuts or whatever it is that we're talking about, you will see that the resources will shift to the good where we can make more money, which means we would supply less donuts and more muffins during that shift or change in price. Okay? So when related goods change in price, it's going to cause producers to shift their resources and produce more or less of other things. Okay? First T stands for technology. Technology allows us to produce things faster. So when we have better technology, simply put, our supply is going to increase. Okay? If technology fails us somehow, our supply is going to decrease. Okay? That's a good one to make sure you remember. The second T stands for taxes. And we're actually going to lump a couple things together here. These are all the ways that the government can influence our supply. So one is taxes. Another way is going to be regulations. And the last is what we call subsidies. Oopsies. So taxes and regulations basically cost businesses money. Okay? If you get taxed, you got to pay the government. So you're losing money. If you have to follow certain regulations, then they're going to cost money to meet those regulations. So taxes and regulations, because they cost money, they limit our production. They're going to make it so we can't produce as much, so our supply is going to decrease. Subsidies, on the other hand, I like to refer to them as a reverse tax. Okay? When the government pays a subsidy, they're actually paying a business money to help them out. And so a subsidy would actually cause the supply to increase because we're going to have more money available to produce. The E stands for expectations. So as suppliers, there's things that cause us to change how we're doing things based off of expectations that we have. A big expectation is weather. If we expect the weather to change, then we're going to change our production to meet the consumer's needs. Okay? And the last determinant is number of suppliers. And actually, I'm going to throw one more thing on here. They both start with N. Number of suppliers or natural disasters. Both of those can influence the supply. Number of suppliers is all about how many businesses are producing that product. So businesses start up or businesses fail, and that influences the supply within that market, the supply of cars or the supply of computers or cell phones or whatever. Okay? Natural disasters can be either, usually I guess they're a bad thing, but I guess you could have favorable weather that could also be a good thing as well. It wouldn't be a disaster, but you could have like the perfect amount of rain or the perfect amount of sunshine could cause the supply of certain products to do well. Typically, though, natural disasters are going to ruin things. They're going to ruin our resources. They're going to ruin our crops and things like that. So what we're trying to show you here, okay, is that these are the list of things. Let me go back to our supply curve that cause the supply to shift. We've got price, we've got quantity, we've got our supply curve that's always upward sloping. We label that with an S, okay? And, let's say that we are supplying, it's a horrible supply curve. Too small. Still too small. There we go. So let's say that we're supplying donuts, okay? And there's let's say there is a decrease in the price of flour. Well, we should know that flour is a resource used to make donuts. So when the price of flour decreases, that's going to create an increase in supply. Okay? And on my graph, I'm going to illustrate that by shifting the whole supply curve to the right. Draw a new supply curve. And that is an example of an increase in supply. The decrease in the price of flour allows me to make more donuts. My supply curve shifts to the right. Okay? A decrease in supply would be the opposite. We'd shift the curve to the left. And so that's important for us to know as we enter tomorrow. We're going to start talking about combining both supply and demand and graphing them both together. Okay? Questions on that at all? Everybody have this down? You want me to hold off for a second? I don't want to X out until you have it. Good? All right.